The stillness of the desert night was broken by a distant thud. Marcus Hale, sitting in the corner of his humble shack, didn't flinch. He recognized the sound immediately, the muffled hum of landing thrusters. His hands tightened around the polished grip of his sniper rifle, one of the few relics of his past that he couldn't part with. The peace he had built here, on the far edge of a forgotten planet, was crumbling. He could feel it in his bones. "He's here!" The whisper crackled over the comms in a language Marcus hadn't heard in years but understood all too well. Alien mercenaries, likely hired by the same factions that had once rallied against humanity, were closing in. Their footsteps were light, cautious, as they approached the small outpost. Marcus knew they wouldn't be far behind. He couldn't help but smirk. After all these years, they still feared him. Stepping outside, Marcus scanned the barren landscape. Moonlight bathed the desert, casting long shadows on the cracked earth. He could sense the tension in the air, the anticipation of a coming storm. Somewhere out there, hidden in the dark, they were watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He wouldn't give them the chance. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, almost comforting. Marcus exhaled, raising it to his shoulder. Through the scope, he spotted movement, a flicker of light reflecting off alien armor, barely a speck in the distance. He adjusted his aim, finger hovering over the trigger. A breath, slow and steady. Then the shot. The silence shattered. A distant figure crumpled, falling into the sand, the life drained from its body before the others could react. Panic rippled through the group of alien hunters as they scrambled for cover. Marcus calmly lowered the rifle. The fear in their retreat was palpable. But it wasn't over. Not yet. With the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting his craft, Marcus took cover behind a rocky outcrop, eyes scanning for the inevitable retaliation. His thoughts raced back to the endless war that had driven him into exile. Humanity had once been the galaxy's elite, a tactical force feared by every species. And snipers like Marcus had been their most feared weapon. But now, they were relics, hunted to extinction. A voice crackled through the darkness. "Hale, we know who you are. You can't run from this. Surrender now, and your death will be quick." Marcus chuckled softly. "I've heard that one before." He moved swiftly, ducking between the rocks and cliffs that formed the natural landscape. Years of fighting had trained his body to work on instinct, blending with his surroundings, becoming one with the terrain. The aliens wouldn't know where he'd strike next. They tried. A few rounds of plasma fire lit up the night, but Marcus wasn't there to be hit. He was a shadow, a ghost. By the time they regrouped, another one had fallen, a perfect shot through the helmet. The whispers grew frantic over their comms. Fear, pure, unfiltered fear. Marcus thrived on it. But as the last of them retreated into the night, Marcus didn't feel victorious. Instead, a familiar weariness settled over him. The galaxy hadn't forgotten him. No matter how far he ran or how deep he hid, they would always come. He glanced down at his rifle, its cold metal gleaming under the moonlight. "It's never over," he muttered, turning back toward his small, broken home. His solitude was shattered, and the fight had only just begun. Tomorrow, more would come. And Marcus would be ready. Marcus watched the sun begin to rise over the horizon, the light casting long, pale shadows across the desert. His rifle rested across his lap, fingers absently tracing its worn edges. The night's skirmish was over, but the battle within him had just begun. He knew what the morning would bring: more mercenaries, more bounty hunters, and perhaps worse. The galaxy had once hailed him as a hero, but now they only wanted his blood. The door to his shack creaked open, and Marcus glanced up to see Ava stepping out. She had arrived on the planet 6 months ago, claiming to be a simple drifter. He didn't trust her fully, but in a galaxy where friends were rare and enemies plentiful, company was better than isolation. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the signs of the previous night's fight. "Looks like they found us again," she said, her voice flat, hiding whatever emotion she might have felt. Marcus nodded. "They'll keep coming." Ava crouched beside him, her hands resting on her knees. "Why don't you run?" You're good at that. Her tone was casual, but Marcus could hear the challenge beneath her words. I've been running for too long, Marcus replied, his eyes locked on the distant hills. There's nowhere left to hide. Ava tilted her head, studying him for a moment. You could leave this rock. Plenty of places in the galaxy where they wouldn't bother hunting you. Marcus shook his head. It's not about running anymore. They'll never stop. Not until they've erased the last of us. Ava frowned. Us? You mean, the human snipers? She paused, realizing she was treading dangerous ground. You know, they talk about you like you're some kind of boogeyman out there. The way they fear you, it's more than just skill. Marcus finally met her gaze. It's because they know what we did. They know what we're capable of. Silence fell between them, the weight of unspoken memories thick in the air. Ava leaned back on her heels, contemplating his words. She had heard the stories, of course, of the war, of the impossible shots that changed the tides of battle, of the snipers who could kill from a mile away without hesitation. But hearing it from Marcus made it real. They were just here to kill you, Ava said after a moment, her voice softer. So, what's the plan now? Marcus stood, his muscles stiff from the night's fight. We prepare. They'll send more. Stronger, faster, smarter. Ava's lips twisted into a smirk. You sound almost excited. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. Excited? No. But ready. He strode toward the edge of the cliff overlooking the desert below. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of scorched metal and ozone, remnants of the plasma shots that had filled the night. Far off in the distance, a ship's silhouette caught his eye, another bounty hunter. Maybe two. They would land soon. Ava joined him, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the same shapes. They're not wasting any time. They won't. Not now. For the first time, Marcus felt the weight of what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. The galaxy had made him a symbol of everything they feared in humanity. Its resilience, its cunning, its ruthlessness. They had turned him into something to be hunted, but Marcus had never asked for this fight. He had simply been good at surviving. The ship descended rapidly, kicking up dust as it touched down on the outskirts of the valley. Marcus reached for his rifle, feeling the familiar weight in his hands once more. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about sending a message. The galaxy needed to remember what it had feared all those years ago. Ava looked at him, her expression hardening. You're going to fight them all, aren't you? Marcus glanced at her, his eyes cold but determined. No choice now. As the landing bay doors of the approaching ship opened, revealing armored figures ready to strike, Marcus took a slow, steady breath. The tension in the air thickened, the quiet before the storm. Stay low, he said, his voice calm and steady. This is going to get loud. With one fluid motion, Marcus raised the rifle to his shoulder, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Ava crouched beside him, her hand hovering over the hilt of her blade. The wind whispered across the desert as the armored hunters began their approach, their movements precise, disciplined. For a moment, the world stood still. Then Marcus fired, and all hell broke loose. The first shot hit the lead hunter square in the visor, shattering the faceplate in an explosion of sparks and smoke. Marcus didn't pause, already tracking the next target. The second shot followed immediately, piercing through the gap in an enemy's armor as they attempted to take cover. 2 down, 6 to go. Ava crouched low beside him, her breathing steady, eyes flicking between Marcus and the advancing hunters. The mercenaries moved with precision, their steps synchronized, each seeking an opening in the sniper's relentless barrage. But Marcus was unrelenting, his rifle a seamless extension of his will. They're flanking! Ava shouted, her hand tightening on the hilt of her blade. Marcus shifted his aim, firing off another round as 2 hunters broke off, racing toward the left. They had learned from the previous mercenaries' mistakes. They weren't reckless. They were calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Stay low, Marcus muttered, his gaze never leaving the battlefield. If they get close, take them out. But only if you have to. Ava nodded, her face set in grim determination. She had been in tight spots before, but there was something different about this fight, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was in Marcus. He was fighting like a man who had nothing left to lose. The hunters closed in, their heavy boots thudding against the hard-packed ground as they zigzagged between rocks and debris, making themselves harder targets. Marcus fired again, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, but this time, the shot went wide, narrowly missing one of the mercenaries. "They're getting smarter," Ava said, her voice tense. "They're pushing you to miss." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. Every breath, every heartbeat had to be perfectly timed. One mistake, one missed shot, and it would all be over. He squeezed the trigger again, and another hunter dropped to the ground motionless. But the rest were almost on them now. With a sudden burst of speed, two hunters broke from cover, rushing Marcus's position with blasters raised. Their suits whirred with enhanced speed, making it nearly impossible to track them. Marcus swung his rifle toward them, but before he could take the shot, Ava was already moving. In a blur of motion, she drew her blade and sprinted toward the attackers. The first hunter swung his blaster around to fire, but Ava was too fast. Her blade flashed, cutting through the air with lethal precision. The hunter's arm fell limp, blaster clattering to the ground, followed by a swift kick to his chest that sent him crashing to the dirt. The second hunter aimed at Ava's back, but Marcus was ready. He pulled the trigger, and the enemy crumpled to the ground, a hole burned clean through his chest plate. Ava stood over the fallen hunter, her chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. She wiped the sweat from her brow, then shot a glance at Marcus. "I thought you said only if I had to." Marcus lowered his rifle, his gaze shifting to the remaining hunters in the distance. "That was close enough." Ava snorted but didn't argue. "3 left. They won't come in close again," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "They'll keep their distance and wait for backup." And just as he spoke, the whine of engines echoed from the sky. Ava looked up, her face paling as 2 more ships appeared on the horizon. "Reinforcements. They're throwing everything at us," she muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. Marcus didn't respond. He simply reloaded his rifle, each motion slow and deliberate. His mind was racing, calculating their odds. They couldn't hold out forever. The hunters were relentless, and more would come. "Why are they so desperate?" Ava asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "It's not just the bounty, is it? This is personal." Marcus glanced at her, his face unreadable. "To them it is. I was part of the unit that took down their leader during the war. Their boss has wanted me dead ever since." Ava's brows knitted together. "You didn't think to mention that sooner? It wouldn't have changed anything." Marcus slung his rifle over his shoulder. They were coming either way. The hunters began repositioning, setting up sniper positions of their own on the distant ridges. Marcus could see them moving in the shadows, barely visible through the rocky outcrops. They were planning to pin him down, force him into a firefight he couldn't win. "We need to move," Marcus said, scanning the terrain for an escape route. "We won't survive another wave out here." Ava clenched her jaw, knowing he was right. "Where to?" "Back into the canyon. I know a place we can hole up." Marcus grabbed her by the arm, pulling her behind a boulder as a volley of blaster fire struck the ground where they had just been standing. They dashed toward the canyon, the roar of ships growing louder behind them. Marcus could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but beneath that, something deeper, a grim certainty that this fight was far from over. As they disappeared into the shadows of the canyon, Marcus knew one thing for sure: the real battle had yet to begin. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, kicking up dust and sending it swirling around Marcus and Ava as they ran. The towering rock walls loomed on either side, jagged and foreboding, casting long shadows that twisted in the dying light. The hum of the approaching ships grew louder behind them, and the mercenaries weren't far off, closing in with deadly precision. Ava glanced over her shoulder, watching the black specks of enemy ships grow larger on the horizon. We're out of time, Marcus. I know, he said, his voice steady, though his eyes were sharp, calculating. But we still have one card to play. Ava's brow furrowed as she followed his gaze deeper into the canyon. The jagged cliffs narrowed into a tight pass, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Beyond that, the walls opened into a hollowed cavern, and Ava immediately understood. It was a perfect choke point. They'll funnel in, she said, catching her breath. You plan to take them out one by one. Marcus gave a grim nod. It's the only shot we've got. Together, they moved quickly into the mouth of the pass, and Marcus began setting up his sniper rifle on a high rock ledge, giving him a vantage point over the narrow path. Ava crouched beside him, watching as the first of the hunters began to appear at the far end of the canyon, their black armor glinting in the fading sunlight. They'll swarm us, Ava said quietly, her hand tightening on her blade. We can't hold them off forever. Marcus adjusted the scope on his rifle, the familiar cold metal in his grip grounding him. We don't need forever. Just long enough to thin the herd. Ava nodded, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. She had faced worse odds before, but this felt different. These hunters weren't just any enemy, they were trained, methodical, and relentless. And they had one goal: take Marcus down, no matter the cost. The first shot rang out, echoing through the canyon like a thunderclap. One of the hunters fell, his body slamming into the rocks below. Marcus didn't flinch, already tracking the next target. Another shot. Another down. But the hunters were quick to adapt. Instead of charging in a straight line, they spread out, moving with a disciplined efficiency that made them harder to hit. Marcus fired again, the shot grazing one of the hunters but not enough to stop them. They're learning, Marcus muttered. Ava's eyes narrowed as she spotted movement in the distance, more ships, larger than the first wave. Reinforcements. They're coming in hot, Marcus, she said, her voice tight. What's the play when we're outnumbered? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze locked on the approaching forces. We make them bleed for every step they take. The next wave of hunters was already at the mouth of the pass. They advanced cautiously, shields raised, blasters at the ready. Marcus picked off another two before they reached cover, but it wasn't enough. The rest were closing in fast. Ava moved before he could stop her, vaulting down the rocks with a grace that belied the danger. Her blade flashed in the dim light as she engaged the first hunter, her movements a blur of speed and precision. She dodged a blaster shot, her sword slicing through the hunter's armor with lethal efficiency. But the others were already on her. Damn it, Ava! Marcus swore under his breath, his heart pounding as he tried to cover her from above. But even with his skill, he couldn't protect her from all angles. A shot grazed her arm, and she staggered, but she didn't stop. More hunters poured into the pass, their numbers overwhelming. Marcus fired again and again, but the enemy was closing in too fast. The hollow cavern behind them seemed to shrink as the sound of approaching engines filled the air. He could hear the whine of the incoming ships, feel the vibrations in the ground as they prepared to land. We can't hold this, Ava yelled, her voice strained as she parried another strike. We need a plan B. Marcus's mind raced. There wasn't time. No way out. But then, as if answering his silent desperation, a memory flickered, something he'd seen on the map earlier. The cave. Fall back! Marcus yelled, abandoning his position on the ledge. He slid down the rocky slope and grabbed Ava by the arm, pulling her toward the hollow at the far end of the canyon. There's a cave. We can make a stand there. Ava didn't argue, though she was breathing heavily, blood staining her sleeve. Together they ran, the hunters hot on their heels, blaster fire cracking through the air around them. Marcus fired a few shots over his shoulder, trying to slow them down, but it was no use. They were too close. They reached the mouth of the cave just as the first of the hunters caught up, their heavy boots pounding against the rocks. Marcus and Ava ducked inside, the narrow entrance forcing their enemies to bottleneck once more. This better be a good plan, Ava muttered, pressing her back against the cool stone wall as she caught her breath. Marcus reloaded his rifle, his jaw set in determination. We either hold this, or we die. The first hunter stepped into the cave, his blaster raised, but before he could fire, Marcus pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the confined space, and the hunter dropped to the ground. More followed, but now Marcus and Ava had the advantage. The narrow confines of the cave made it impossible for the hunters to overwhelm them all at once. One by one, the hunters fell, but the ships outside had landed. Heavy footsteps echoed in the canyon. The next wave was coming, and Marcus knew these would be tougher. He glanced at Ava, her expression grim but resolute. Ready for round 2? She smiled, though there was exhaustion behind her eyes. Always. As the final wave of hunters stormed the cave, Marcus braced himself. There was no retreat now. This was their last stand. And for the first time in years, he felt something more than survival, something like hope.